What if the greatest leader in Christian history was actually the most spectacular failure? What if the man who would become the rock upon which Christ built his church was the same man who would deny knowing Jesus 3 times in his darkest hour? The story of Simon Peter is perhaps the most shocking transformation in human history, a tale of breathtaking failure followed by impossible redemption that challenges everything we think we know about courage, faith, and the power of divine grace to transform the most broken of hearts. The nets were coming up empty again. Simon had cast them into the familiar waters of Galilee countless times, but something felt different about this particular morning. The fish that had sustained his family for generations seemed to have vanished overnight. Little did he know that within hours, a stranger's words would shatter everything he thought he knew about his future, and reveal why his nets had been deliberately kept empty. His brother Andrew burst through the pre-dawn darkness, breathless and wild-eyed with news that would change everything. Andrew claimed to have found the Messiah, a bold declaration that could mean life or death in occupied Palestine. But there was something in Andrew's voice, something in his trembling hands, that suggested he had encountered far more than just another traveling rabbi. The urgency in his movements betrayed a man who had witnessed something that defied explanation, something that demanded immediate action. The meeting that followed would prove to be one of the most pivotal moments in human history, though Simon had no way of knowing it. When the stranger's eyes met his own, time seemed to suspend itself. The crowd around them faded into meaningless noise. Without explanation, without context, Jesus spoke a single sentence that would haunt Simon for the rest of his life. He would no longer be called Simon, but Peter, the rock. The irony of this declaration would soon become devastatingly clear, for Peter would prove to be anything but stable in the trials ahead. What happened next defied all logic and social convention. Jesus issued an invitation that no reasonable fisherman should have accepted, to abandon everything and become fishers of men. Yet, within moments, Peter found himself dropping his nets mid-cast, leaving his father Zebedee standing speechless on the shore, walking away from the only life he had ever known to follow a man he had known for mere minutes. The question that would torment him for years to come had already begun forming in the depths of his mind. What power did this stranger possess that could compel such instant, life-altering obedience? The months that followed would test every assumption Peter held about reality itself. He witnessed events that natural law declared impossible, the blind receiving sight with nothing more than a touch, the lame throwing away their crutches and dancing with joy, storms that had terrified seasoned fishermen obeying spoken commands like well-trained servants. But with each miracle came deeper questions, more unsettling implications about the true identity of the man he had chosen to follow. Peter found himself caught between unprecedented faith and growing terror at what he was beginning to understand about the nature of divine power walking among mortals. The crowds grew larger and more desperate with each passing day. Thousands pressed in from every direction, seeking healing, seeking hope, seeking answers to questions that had plagued humanity since the beginning of time. Peter watched as Jesus moved through these masses with supernatural compassion, never growing weary, never turning anyone away. Yet beneath the surface of these miraculous encounters, Peter sensed an undercurrent of something darker. Religious leaders watching from the shadows, plotting something that made his blood run cold. The tension reached a breaking point near Caesarea Philippi when Jesus posed the question that would define Christianity for millennia. "Who do you say that I am?" The other disciples offered safe answers. Elijah, John the Baptist, one of the prophets returned from the dead. But Peter's response erupted from somewhere deeper than conscious thought, a declaration so profound that Jesus himself attributed it to divine revelation. "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Yet even as Peter spoke these world-changing words, he could not have imagined how catastrophically he would fail to live up to them in the darkest hour ahead. The test came sooner than expected, revealing the terrifying fragility of human understanding. When Jesus began speaking of suffering, death, and resurrection, Peter's newfound understanding crumbled like sand castles before a tsunami. His rebuke of Jesus seemed born of loyalty. After all, how could the Son of God suffer and die? But the response he received was so harsh, so cutting, that it revealed a truth more disturbing than any he had yet encountered. Even the most spiritually enlightened moments could instantly transform into satanic opposition. The question that haunted Peter's sleepless nights was becoming urgent. If divine revelation could be followed so quickly by demonic influence, how could anyone ever be certain of their spiritual state? But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared Peter for what happened on the water that night. The storm had been fierce enough, trapping the disciples in their boat, while waves the size of houses threatened to overwhelm them. They had rowed for hours against the wind, their hands raw and bleeding, their strength nearly exhausted. Then came the impossible sight, a figure walking on the churning surface as if it were solid ground, approaching through the darkness with supernatural calm. Peter's request to join Jesus on the waves seemed to spring from pure faith, and for several miraculous steps he defied the laws of physics that had governed his entire life as a fisherman. But then came the moment that would torment him forever. The instant when his focus shifted from Jesus to the towering waves around him, when doubt crept in like poison, when he began to sink beneath the surface of the very waters he had just conquered. The rescue that followed raised questions more disturbing than the miracle itself. What separated faith from failure? Why was the line between walking on water and drowning so terrifyingly thin? And most haunting of all, if he could doubt in the presence of such overwhelming supernatural power, when would he ever be truly safe from failure? The months that followed brought increasingly ominous signs that their time together was drawing to a close. Jesus spoke more frequently of betrayal, suffering, and death. The religious leaders' hostility intensified with each passing day. The crowds that had once celebrated Jesus with palm branches and shouts of Hosanna seemed increasingly fickle, their enthusiasm dampened by teachings that challenged their expectations of a political Messiah. Peter sensed that everything was building towards some climactic confrontation, but he could never have anticipated the form it would take. The final test arrived on the darkest night of Peter's life, though he didn't recognize it as such when it began. The evening had started with such promise. The Passover meal, intimate conversation with Jesus, declarations of eternal loyalty that seemed unshakable. Peter's boastful promise to die for his master echoed confidently in the upper room. Even if all fall away, I will not. But those words would soon return to mock him with their hollow bravado as armed guards dragged Jesus away like a common criminal. The courage Peter had promised, the willingness to die for his master, evaporated in the face of immediate danger. He had drawn his sword in the garden, even struck the high priest's servant in a desperate attempt to defend Jesus. But when Jesus rebuked him and healed the wounded man, Peter found himself adrift in confusion and terror. If Jesus would not defend himself, if he would not allow others to defend him, what hope was there for any of them? What happened next would haunt Peter far more than simple cowardice ever could. Following Jesus at a distance, he found himself in the courtyard of the high priest's house, warming his hands by a fire, while the man he had sworn to protect faced illegal trials inside. 3 times that night, ordinary people identified Peter as one of Jesus's followers. A servant girl by the fire, another bystander who recognized his Galilean accent, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off in the garden. 3 times he denied any association with Jesus with increasing vehemence. But the third denial crossed a line that changed everything. Peter found himself cursing and swearing, calling down damnation upon himself if he were lying about knowing Jesus. The words poured out of him like poison, each syllable a betrayal that cut deeper than the last. At that precise moment, as the vilest oaths left his lips, a rooster crowed in the distance, its call piercing the night air like an accusation. But what happened next would break Peter's heart completely. Jesus, being led through the courtyard in chains, his face bloodied and swollen from beatings, turned and looked directly at him. No words were exchanged, none were needed. In that gaze lay everything: disappointment that cut like a sword, forgiveness that was almost too wonderful to bear, love that transcended betrayal, and an unbearable sadness that would echo in Peter's soul for the rest of his life. Peter fled into the darkness, weeping with a desperation that seemed to tear his very soul apart. The crucifixion appeared to end everything. The man Peter had declared to be the Son of God hung dead on a Roman cross, his body broken, his blood spilled. His mission apparently failed in the most public and humiliating way possible. The darkness that covered the land for 3 hours seemed to settle permanently over Peter's heart. He returned to his nets, perhaps hoping that the familiar rhythm of fishing might somehow restore meaning to a world that had collapsed around him. But even the fish seemed to mock him. The nets came up empty, just as they had on that morning when Jesus first called him to follow. The nightmare seemed complete, but it was far from over. In fact, the most impossible chapter was about to begin. The women returned from the tomb at dawn on the third day with news so extraordinary that it seemed like the ravings of grief-stricken minds. Jesus was alive. The stone had been rolled away. Angels had appeared. The body was gone. Peter ran to the tomb with John, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and terror. The empty grave clothes he discovered confirmed the impossible claim, but raised even more disturbing questions. If Jesus had indeed conquered death itself, what did that mean for Peter's betrayal? Would there be consequences beyond imagination? And this possibility was almost too wonderful to contemplate. Could there be forgiveness for the unforgivable? The appearances that followed over the next 40 days challenged everything Peter thought he knew about life, death, and the boundaries between the physical and spiritual realms. Jesus appeared to the disciples behind locked doors, his resurrection body bearing the scars of crucifixion, yet possessing abilities that defied natural law. He ate fish to prove his physical reality, yet vanished and reappeared at will. Each encounter left Peter more convinced of Jesus' victory over death, yet more uncertain about his own standing with the risen Lord. The restoration that followed was more beautiful and terrible than anything Peter could have imagined. By the shores where his journey had begun, where he had first dropped his nets to follow an unknown rabbi, Jesus prepared breakfast over a charcoal fire, the same type of fire where Peter had warmed himself while denying his Lord. The symbolism was inescapable, the parallel deliberate. As they ate together in the early morning light, Jesus asked 3 questions that paralleled Peter's 3 denials, each one an opportunity for redemption, each one a chance to replace betrayal with affirmation. Do you love me more than these? The question cut to the heart of Peter's earlier boastfulness, his claims of superior loyalty. Peter's response revealed how much he had learned about his own limitations. Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Gone was the comparison to others, the boastful confidence. In its place was simple, humble affirmation. Each question about love, each opportunity for affirmation, peeled away another layer of shame and self-doubt. But with each answer came a commission so weighty that it threatened to crush him. Feed my lambs, take care of my sheep, feed my sheep. He was being entrusted with the care of Jesus' flock, given leadership of the entire Christian movement. The man who had failed so catastrophically was being handed the keys to the kingdom. The responsibility was overwhelming, but the real test was still to come. Jesus' final words to Peter were both promise and warning. When you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. The prophecy of martyrdom hung in the air like a sword, yet Peter no longer flinched from the prospect of suffering for his Lord. The transformation was complete, but it had yet to be tested by fire. On the day of Pentecost, everything changed forever. The disciples had waited in Jerusalem as Jesus commanded, uncertain what to expect, still processing the reality of his ascension. Then came the sound like a rushing wind, the tongues of fire, the supernatural ability to speak in languages they had never learned. But most dramatically of all came the transformation of Peter himself. The same Peter who had cowered before a servant girl now stood before thousands of hostile listeners in the very city where Jesus had been crucified, proclaiming the very message that had gotten his master killed. But something had happened to him. Something that transformed cowardice into courage, fear into faith, denial into proclamation. His voice carried across the crowd with supernatural authority as he declared that the Jesus they had crucified was indeed the promised Messiah, risen from the dead and exalted to the right hand of God. The results were staggering. 3,000 people believed in a single day, turning to Christ through the ministry of the man who had denied him just weeks earlier. The early church exploded into existence around Peter's transformed leadership. But even as thousands were added daily to their number, the ultimate test of his transformation still lay ahead. The persecution that followed would make his earlier trials seem like preparation. The same religious authorities who had crucified Jesus now turned their attention to his followers with murderous intent. Prison, beatings, and threats became routine parts of Peter's ministry. Yet instead of breaking his resolve, each trial seemed to strengthen it. When commanded to stop preaching in Jesus' name, Peter's response revealed the complete transformation of his character. We must obey God rather than men. The miracles that flowed through Peter's ministry paralleled those of Jesus himself. The sick were healed, the lame walked, even the dead were raised to life. His shadow falling on people in the street brought healing and deliverance. The man who had once sunk beneath the waves due to doubt now walked in such supernatural power that entire cities were transformed by his presence. Peter's most revolutionary breakthrough came through a vision that challenged everything he thought he knew about God's plan. In a trance on a rooftop in Joppa, he saw a sheep descending from heaven filled with animals that Jewish law declared unclean. The command to kill and eat violated everything he had been taught about holiness and separation. But the voice that spoke from heaven brooked no argument. Do not call anything impure that God has made clean. The meaning became clear when messengers arrived from Cornelius, a Roman centurion who had received his own supernatural vision. As Peter preached to this Gentile household, the Holy Spirit fell upon them just as it had upon the Jewish believers at Pentecost. This moment would reshape Christianity forever, opening the door for the gospel to spread to every nation on earth. But it also revealed a disturbing truth that would echo through the ages. God's plans were far bigger and more radical than anyone had imagined. The expansion of the early church brought new challenges and responsibilities. Peter found himself traveling throughout the known world, establishing churches, training leaders, and strengthening believers in their faith. His letters to scattered Christian communities revealed a mature spiritual leader who had learned to balance boldness with humility, conviction with compassion, and leadership with servanthood. But the greatest trials were yet to come. The final chapters of Peter's story unfolded in the heart of the Roman Empire, where the greatest persecution of Christians was about to begin. Under Emperor Nero's reign, following Christ had become a death sentence. Christians were being crucified, burned alive, and fed to wild animals for the entertainment of Roman crowds. Peter faced the ultimate choice: flee to safety or remain with his flock in their darkest hour. His decision would reveal whether the transformation that had begun on the shores of Galilee was genuine or merely temporary. According to tradition, when other Christians begged Peter to flee Rome, he initially agreed. But as he walked along the Appian Way leading away from the city, he encountered a vision of Jesus walking toward Rome carrying his cross. When Peter asked where he was going, Jesus replied that he was going to Rome to be crucified again. Understanding the rebuke, Peter turned back to face his destiny. The end came as Peter had always known it would, with a cross. Roman soldiers arrested him during Nero's persecution, and he was sentenced to the same death his master had suffered. But in his final act of humility, he made a request that revealed the complete transformation of his character. He asked to be crucified upside down, considering himself unworthy to die in the same manner as his Lord. As the Roman soldiers prepared to carry out the execution, Peter faced the moment that would define his eternal legacy. The fisherman who had once denied knowing Jesus now proclaimed his faith with his final breath. The disciple who had fled in terror from a servant girl now faced Roman executioners with supernatural courage. The man who had boasted of his loyalty and then failed spectacularly now demonstrated ultimate faithfulness through his willingness to die for the gospel he had once denied. But was this truly the end? The transformation was complete, but its impact was just beginning. The fisherman who had failed so catastrophically had become the rock upon which Christ built his church. His letters would guide believers through persecution for centuries to come. His example would inspire countless others to find hope after failure, courage after cowardice, and purpose after despair. The man who had sunk beneath the waves due to doubt had become the foundation upon which an eternal kingdom would be built. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Peter's story is not his transformation, but what it reveals about the nature of divine grace itself. If God could take a cowardly, impulsive fisherman and transform him into the leader of the early church, what might be possible for anyone willing to surrender their failures to divine purpose? The implications are staggering, and the invitation remains open to this day. If this video has touched you, do well to subscribe to this channel, like this video, share with someone, and leave a comment below.